West of Calgary, where more than 50 police officers continue to search for evidence. It's in connection with the suspected murders of a mom and her toddler. Jasmin Lovett and 22-month-old Aaliyah Sanderson have not been seen in 10 days.
The main suspect in this case gave an extremely bizarre interview to a number of press reporters whilst he was drunk and reportedly high. He speaks about an awful lot on camera and has this completely inappropriate laughing and chuckling response when talking about the case. He may even have thought he was going to get away with the double murder he'd been accused of. But what he didn't know was that 2 undercover officers were on their way to catch him out, and he easily and willingly took the bait. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. This show is made from various source documents listed in the show notes. I use news archives, documentary footage and court documents, and so the episodes are accurate to the source material I can find. You can find all episodes on YouTube and also as a podcast version in the description box down below. Jasmin Lovett had given birth to her first child, a baby girl who she called Aaliyah. Jasmin was just 24 years old, and she and Aaliyah's dad had decided to go their separate ways, which meant that Jasmin was going to have to navigate being a first-time mum on her own. It wasn't too long after that Jasmin uploaded her information to a few dating apps and started looking at various people's profiles. It was on one of these apps that she started speaking to a man called Robert Leeming. The pair began talking more and more, and eventually they started kind of casually dating. Robert had a son and Jasmin had a daughter. There was a lot of common ground between the two of them, and although things weren't hugely serious, they were certainly heading in the right direction. The first month flew by, and then one day, Jasmin was messaging Robert when she told him that she was in a bit of a challenging position. She was struggling with housing, and I actually couldn't find the details of what the specifics were here, but it looks as though she was struggling financially, being a newly single mom, caring for Aaliyah on her own, and then juggling rent and bills, working, and all of the other things she now needed to do to run a house and raise her daughter. And so Robert offered that she could move into his place. This wasn't a romantic gesture. Of course, there was an element of the fact that Jasmin needed support and the pair were dating, but more so than that, it seemed practical. At least in hindsight, that's what Robert would say. Robert had the space, and Jasmin would be paying him some money towards the rent and towards bills until she got fully back on her feet and figured out the complexities of motherhood. Jasmin was very close to her sister Genevieve, and so she told her everything. She was very vocal about her relationship with Robert, and her sister had spoken about how she did have concerns about how quickly the relationship had been moving. In terms of Jasmin actually moving in with Robert, just a matter of either weeks or some reports say months, but it was a short time after they had first started speaking. And although Jasmin was initially quite happy with how things were going, it wasn't long before things started to take a downward turn. Jasmin told Genevieve that she just wasn't happy. And at one point, Robert and Jasmin did actually decide to end things, but this didn't last for too long, and the relationship was very much an on and off sort of situation for the next few months. Jasmin did actually become pregnant during one of their on spells of the relationship, but she decided to terminate the pregnancy. Things seemed to get back to a relationship level again, with Jasmin and Robert actually co-parenting Aaliyah, and Jasmin's sister Genevieve spoke about how, by all accounts, Robert seemed to genuinely care for Aaliyah and would actively co-parent with Jasmin. Quote, he would watch Aaliyah if Jasmin had to leave the house. Robert seemed to be very fond of Aaliyah. Everything was about Aaliyah. He almost seemed to care more for Aaliyah than he did for Jasmin. What Jasmin didn't know when she met Robert was very much about his past. Robert grew up in Marlborough in England. This is a place in Wiltshire. It's pretty far south, like west of London. And he had lived there with his mum, dad and 2 brothers. Both of his brothers had a pretty normal upbringing, pretty normal home lives. There really wasn't anything out of the ordinary or of significant note that happened to them. All that their parents could say was abnormal. It was all a pretty normal childhood. For Robert, however, he began to exhibit some quite worrying behaviour from as early as the age of 7. He started showing a fascination with knives and he began collecting them. I will say something here. The boy is 7 years old. How he's been allowed to collect and keep a big old selection of knives is just pretty confusing and very, very unusual. His parents have never spoken outwardly on how or why they let him do this, but the fact is that they did. Beyond that, Robert's teenage years were relatively normal, with him finishing secondary school and making the decision to train in and becoming a mechanic. And during this time of studying, he met a woman online who he started talking to fairly regularly. The woman's name was Sarah. She was from Canada and she was training to become a school teacher. The time difference from England to Canada meant that they would have to meticulously plan when they'd be speaking and how long for, often adjusting the times that they'd sleep so that they could maximise their time speaking with each other. The pair spoke more and more, and eventually they entered into a relationship online. Having an only online relationship, though, wasn't what either of the couple wanted, and so Robert said that he would leave England and come and live with Sarah in Canada. He managed to gain residency in 2013. This is because he obviously had training as a mechanic, and so he was quickly confirmed as a permanent citizen. He moved to Calgary and he lived with Sarah, and things progressed quickly. They got married, they bought a house together, they got a dog together, and once they were all moved in and settled down, they also decided to have a child together, a little baby boy. But after the birth of their son, Sarah and Robert's relationship began to break down. Robert could not hold a job down. In fact, he was often fired or made to leave. And this was due to his behaviour, usually shady ongoings. He was accused multiple times of stealing. Beyond this, he seemed to be just pretty horrific to Sarah and anyone he came into contact with. She also spoke about having been on Robert's computer one day when she came across some very concerning searches. Now look, if you took a look at my internet searches without any context of what I do for a job, then they might have thought that my search history is worrying. But also, people have morbid fascinations. They do find things like this interesting to read about. You guys are an example. I'm an example. I definitely consume true crime content. You're here to listen to me talk about a horrific and brutal crime. That doesn't mean that behaviour is worrying, but for Robert it certainly was. He had searched for 2 articles specifically that Sarah found concerning, and in some way they would sort of come true in the future. One was an article about a mother and a child who had died under suspicious circumstances. This particular case was a house fire, and either way, a search that Sarah found worrying. The second article was about a dog being chained to a tree. Now, the reason that this is significant is because of what happened soon after he read that article and soon after Sarah had discovered it. Robert had returned home one day after taking the family dog Axel out for a walk, and he immediately told Sarah that he had given the dog away. Now, although this might have been a bit suspicious, there really was no reason at the time to think that anything bad had happened to Axel. In reality, Robert had taken Axel out for a walk to this faraway sort of woodland area, tied the dog up, and then just left it there. We know what kind of a red flag hurting animals is and what it can say about you. It is an extremely worrying piece of behaviour. Even more so if it's exhibited as a child. It can be a sort of example or a sign of having sociopathic personality disorder. And even as an adult, it's extremely worrying behaviour. Anyway, Robert was ultimately charged with 3 counts of animal cruelty, including causing a dog to be in distress, failing to provide the dog with adequate food and water, and failing to provide the dog with adequate shelter. Now, the only reason that Sarah or anybody eventually found out what had happened to the dog was because a landowner, where Robert had left Axel just tied up to this tree, had happened to just come across the dog 4 days after Robert had abandoned him. He'd taken this dog to a local vet. A chip in the dog's ear, traced by the investigating animal welfare officers, led to Robert's address. Robert just said the dog, quote, would have chewed, like should have chewed through it. He chewed through everything else. He ate half the house. So that's why I left him there, because he thought he'd just chew his way through his lead and then be fine. Sarah would later cite in official court documents that Robert was emotionally abusive and that he at one time had said that she had ruined his life by having their baby, a child that he never wanted. The relationship breakdown eventually led to Sarah filing for divorce, and this also led to Sarah gaining almost full custody of their son. In fact, Robert was only ever allowed to see their son during limited and specific supervised visits because of a restraining order that she'd taken out against Robert. Sarah feared for her own safety as well as her son's. Jasmin continually spoke to her sister Genevieve about just how unhappy she was with the relationship and how things were with Robert at the moment. She had suspicions that he was cheating on her, and even though he outright denied this when she asked him, she just knew deep down that he was lying and that he wasn't being faithful to her. On the 19th of April 2019, Jasmin and her family were due to have dinner together, but Jasmin never showed up. She hadn't told anyone she wasn't going to be coming, and there just was no reason that she wouldn't have shown up. And so her family members tried calling her, but they got no answers. And eventually, as the evening turned into the next morning, and then the day after that, Jasmin's family began to become increasingly worried. It was extremely out of character for Jasmin to not only miss this family dinner, but also just to not be in touch over the following few days. Jasmin's mum, Kim, headed over to where Jasmin was living at the time, to Robert's house, and she wanted to try and find out what was going on, where her daughter was at. But after knocking on the door and then just waiting and waiting, she soon realised that no one was coming. This was when she really began to worry. If Jasmin wasn't at home, something was seriously wrong. So after 5 days of no word from Jasmin, Kim reported her daughter as missing, and officers were quite good. They immediately agreed to do a welfare check and they headed out to Robert's house. But there was no answer. Now, the officers assumed at this point that Robert would be home during the day, and so they parked up outside and just waited and waited and waited. But still, there was no sign of Jasmin or Robert arriving home. This was until one of the officers noticed that a light had come on inside of the home. The officers realised someone was inside right now, so they made their way back to the front door of Robert's house. And this time they waited, and they even shouted his name to make him aware that they were there and they weren't leaving. And so eventually Robert had no choice but to come downstairs and open the door to them and let them inside. And as the officers made their way into the house, they noticed pretty much straight away that Robert was drunk and likely high. And so they told him, look, we're going to look around. We also want to talk to you, so stay put. And then they started having a conversation with him, and one of the officers said that they were at the residence because Jasmin's family were concerned that they hadn't heard from her. Robert confirmed that he wasn't really concerned. He'd have people live with him before and then just move out. And then the officer pushes, questioning but kind of stating that Jasmin isn't just renting a room, she is his girlfriend. But Robert responds by saying that it's more of a roommate type situation more than a relationship. And the officer confirms exactly how the pair left things and when was the last time that Robert saw Jasmin. And he said it was Thursday and that he had been drinking a lot and things were, quote, in the air. There wasn't much the officers could do. On the 25th of April, officers returned to Robert's house to arrest him. They had been extremely suspicious of his behaviour and of his version of events from the moment they'd spoken to him that night. And although it had taken a total of 6 days since Jasmin and Aaliyah had disappeared, they finally had a warrant to arrest Robert and to search his house. But even with this search warrant, officers actually failed to gain entry initially. They had tried to get in the front door, even using force, but the door just wouldn't budge, it wouldn't open. And when the officers eventually did gain entry through a separate entrance round the back door, they found these 2 huge barge poles extended up against the front door, making it, well, impossible to get in that way. On top of this, they also bizarrely discovered 2 strips of bacon placed in odd areas of the house. One was under a panel of the floor. Now, when Robert was being questioned, his version of events was that he'd last seen both Jasmin and Aaliyah when they all went for a picnic in the hamlet of Bragg Creek on the 18th of April. So this is the day before Jasmin missed that dinner with her family. Robert said that Jasmin and Aaliyah were both in the house the next day, so the morning of the 19th of April, but when he returned home later on, they'd both left the house and he just never saw them again. His alibi was that he was with a female friend when Jasmin and Aaliyah went missing. Although Robert's arrest was warranted, the house search didn't throw up anything significant and there were no witnesses or any trail that they could see at the time. And so the investigating team of the police force had no choice but to let him go. Now, Robert, he's this worried partner, or even his version, let's say he's a friend. Obviously, Jasmin and her young daughter Aaliyah are missing. He's just been questioned. He's been let go, left the police station, and rather than returning home or to go out and look for them, instead he goes to a bar and just gets drunk. And after that, he left that bar and he had gone to this liquor store and he just started speaking to press outside of that liquor store. The video footage from the press, from their release, is pretty disturbing. Robert is very clearly drunk. He's potentially also high and he keeps breaking out into maniacal laughter and just sort of juttering his head and body in really odd ways.
And then they, like, the SWAT team came and fucking just mowed me down. Yeah. like seriously, like just fucking slapped me on the ground and it's like, yeah, you're under arrest for homicide. Great, thanks guys. Like that.
Okay.
It's crazy.
Maybe go check it out and just...
Look, I win anything, I don't think. So yeah. Pardon me. The door's closed, so I don't know.
I would go through the front, like there's...
I'm not even going to try and go.
Oh, okay. You just...
I don't want to get in trouble.
No. Okay.
I've had enough stress.
Yeah. Okay.
But,
yeah. Okay.
hope she's alright. I mean, what do you do, right?
How do you feel about this whole thing? I mean,
Terrible, of course.
But to know the police are calling this a homicide, to know that someone has killed a 22-month-old child.
It's crazy.
But you're saying that is not you.
Of course not. Of course not.
On the 5th of May 2019, Robert was hanging out around near to where he was for that previous interview. And he's just outside of that liquor shop. And then 2 men come up to him and they say that they recognise him from having seen his interview air on TV. Quote, "You're the dude from the news. You're a fucking rock star." These 2 men were actually undercover officers and they were part of a major undercover operation looking specifically into Robert. The men spoke about how concerned they were and how they felt empathy for him. And they also said they had some information. They knew someone, a neighbour of his, who had found a bag of evidence with incriminating things to suggest that Robert was guilty of doing harm to both Jasmin and Aaliyah. And this is pretty wild, but Robert fully believes, or seems to believe, that these 2 random strangers that happened to just run into him outside of this random shop, he believes them, so much so that he actually agrees to go with them to a warehouse area where they assured him there'd be no worries about anyone overhearing. It was a secure location, and they all go there together. And then these two men show him some guns, and they convince him that they knew what he'd done because of this evidence the neighbour had apparently found. They thought that he'd be a good person to help them with their criminal activities. Robert is suspicious at various points, and he does at one point even ask if they're police, but of course they say no. And over the following few hours, Robert begins to trust them even more, and he actually gives a detailed account of what exactly happened. Now, this section is what Robert said happened, so we don't know the absolute accuracy of the details, but I'll talk more about that shortly. The investigating team had pulled together a large amount of CCTV footage and eyewitness accounts, and they were really building their case. They could identify that the last time Jasmin and Aaliyah were officially seen was on the 16th of April at a shop, and the camera footage tracks Jasmin walking with Aaliyah in her pushchair through the shop. This was before reports on this conflict is either they headed home to join Robert, or Robert ended up picking up Aaliyah from daycare and bringing her home while Jasmin was out. The reason Robert gave for Jasmin being out was because apparently she had an interview, and so Robert had agreed to look after Aaliyah. Robert then told the undercover officers this is what happened. Jasmin returned a little later on that evening. She and Robert ate dinner, and then afterwards, Jasmin went upstairs to check on Aaliyah, and to her horror, found that she was dead in her bed. But Robert claimed that Aaliyah had fallen down the stairs. He said he just didn't realise how injured she was, and so he just put her to bed. Quote, "I heard a thump and I saw her lying on the ground. She seemed all right. I picked her up and dusted her off." After that, he says he just left her in her bed, and she supposedly died whilst in bed. He went on to say that he and Jasmin then started arguing, and this progressed to the point that Robert went to the kitchen, found a hammer, and then brought it back to attack Jasmin with, and he had struck her twice in the head. Quote, "I snapped and hit her with a hammer on the head. I remember hitting her twice, but if you snap, Robert, you aren't then going back for a second hit." And even with those two blows, he also had to go to the kitchen in the first place, get the hammer, bring it back, and then attack Jasmin. There is nothing about this that screams that he just snapped. After that, he then left the room to, and again, I've seen this reported slightly differently in different places, but court documents state that Robert then went to the garage and got one of his guns before returning and shooting Jasmin once, with the bullet actually embedding itself in the brainstem, and so she died instantly. And again, we literally had a similar thing happen in a case I covered just a couple of weeks ago. This guy then goes on to say that he wanted to help her out. The woman he's supposed to be in a relationship with, this woman he's just hit with a hammer twice after taking the life of her child. After all of that, he said, quote, "She was dying and I wanted it to stop. It was the only thing I thought would be quick." Like he's doing her a favour. Get a grip, you absolute twat. Robert then started cleaning up the crime scene, and he started by using just sort of paper towels to try and mop up the extensive amounts of blood that had come from Jasmin's head wounds. And then he wrapped both Aaliyah and Jasmin's bodies in a blanket, and then he loaded them into his car. Robert finished telling the two undercover officers about this series of events, and then he said that the police had been looking in the wrong places. And so the two men offered to help properly dispose of the bodies, and Robert agreed. And so he then drove with the men, these two undercover officers, to an area of woodland near Bragg Creek. And Robert got there and pointed at the blanket, this same blanket that Robert had used to wrap and help transport Aaliyah and Jasmin's bodies. And underneath that blanket, it was immediately clear that the dead bodies lay there. And Jasmin had clearly been shot in the head, and Aaliyah had trauma to her head as well. Because of this, both of their heads had been wrapped in blue plastic bags, I suppose to sort of contain the blood. After Robert had initially dumped the bodies, he had actually returned soon after to sort of cover them up a bit more. And he claimed that hiding the bodies was all part of his plan to get away with the crime of murder. But he said that this was just the murder of Jasmin, and he maintained his innocence when it came to Aaliyah, which I actually imagine is just because everyone knows that if you are a child killer or you abuse a child and you go to prison for it, you are at the bottom of the ladder in terms of prison hierarchy. He also actually had the audacity to say that he buried Aaliyah and Jasmin together because he didn't want them to be alone. Oh, cheers, pal. Very well done. Very good for you. When he was asked what he and Jasmin had argued about, he said that they argued a lot and that generally they were arguing. Jasmin wanted to get married, he didn't. Jasmin maybe wanted children in the future with him, he didn't. The officers didn't really believe him, but they confiscated his phone and sent it for forensic analysis to see what other evidence they could get. And they found that on the same night as the officers had initially gone to Robert's house to question him, a few hours after that, Robert had gone onto his phone and he had deleted a number of items, including almost 40 photos of Jasmin and Aaliyah, as well as various messages from Jasmin. On further investigation, the officers managed to find various pieces of evidence from the days following the disappearances. Well, following the murders now. There was CCTV footage from a petrol station, or gas station, because we're in Canada. And Robert is seen filling up his car and also buying a can of gasoline as well. And there was the stench of gasoline on the bodies. So it's clear that that's most likely what he bought that for. There's also CCTV from the housing complex where he's seen throwing away a number of items. And officers searched through those rubbish bins outside of the house and they did find a certain number of things that they brought in as evidence. Following this, Robert was charged with the murders of both Jasmin and Aaliyah. And although we know he's admitted at this point to murdering Jasmin, he continues to claim that he didn't kill Aaliyah and that she died accidentally. He was not responsible for her death. Robert was also asked about the 2 pieces of bacon that were found in those different areas of the house. That very clearly fresh, just placed there, bacon. It was clearly intentional and it had happened just moments before the police had forced entry. Robert admitted that he had put those pieces of bacon in different areas of the house because, quote, pork is the closest thing to people in the way that dogs react to them. This man is infuriating. He is a little boy who takes no responsibility, has no empathy, no heart. He is one of the most pathetic people I've ever come across when researching a case. And we are on episode 112 or 113. We're up there. So pretty pathetic. The court also said that they didn't know when Aaliyah had been murdered. And Robert had lied so much during his testimony that he just couldn't be trusted. His version of events couldn't be trusted. It was ultimately concluded that Jasmin was killed first and then Aaliyah was murdered sometime afterwards. The court stated it may have been soon after that same night or even once he arrived in Bragg Creek to dispose of Jasmin's body. This added to the defence's argument that it was highly probable that Robert had time to reflect on what he'd done to Jasmin before going on to kill Aaliyah. They also spoke of how, after disposing of both Jasmin and Aaliyah's bodies, Robert had first cleaned his car, he'd got rid of a number of their personal belongings, and then he'd gone home and he had used Jasmin's bank card to order food. It was revealed that at the time of the murders, Robert owned various different types of guns and he had over 60 knives, Many of these were from his collection that he'd been gathering since he was a child. But there was one more damning piece of evidence. The medical report from Aaliyah's autopsy showed that her injuries could not have come from falling down the stairs. It was found that she would have suffered seizures and she would have been, quote, gasping for air. It would have been clear that she was in real trouble. Robert could not have just taken her up to bed and not known that she was close to death, if not already dead. The falling down the stairs story had been disproved in various ways and simply did not happen. Ultimately, Robert was found guilty at trial on both counts of second-degree murder, and he was given a life sentence with a chance of parole after 22 years. If he does get parole, ever, then he will be sent back to the UK. So that is great news for us over here. Please do not parole that absolute waste of space. The minimum amount of time that he could have been in prison before parole consideration was 10 years, and the absolute maximum was 25 years. So that 22-year minimum was actually satisfactory to Jasmin's family, who said that 200 years wasn't going to bring back their daughter and their granddaughter, and so 22 years was justice in their eyes. And before I go, you might have seen that I did an interview recently with New York Times best-selling author Amy Tintera about her new book, Listen for the Lie. I read this and I bloody loved it. It is about a woman who gets contacted by this true crime podcaster who is covering this woman's best friend's murder. This book fulfilled all of my thriller, crime, fiction needs. And look, I'm never picking up a book for the comedy, but this book was well funny and has the best portrayal of a grandmother-granddaughter relationship that I have ever seen. I want to know this woman's gran. She's like mine, was kind, funny, and just like dryly sarcastic. So I'm giving away 10 copies of this book. This is open only to UK residents at this point because I'm paying postage myself, and it'd just be well expensive to post 10 books overseas. But I promise that I will do a giveaway that includes other countries, not just the UK. And I will do that when we hit 100,000 subscribers. So we're only 70k off, guys. It's going to happen. We are a little way off, but I definitely want to celebrate that when we get there. So I guess keep an eye out for that. For UK listeners, watchers, to be in it with a chance of winning this book, all you need to do is go to our Instagram, which I'll put in the description box. Click on the giveaway post, tag one friend who you think would enjoy this book, and that's it. I guess you can enter as many times as you like. Make sure you're following my Instagram at RedRumTrueCrime so that if you win, I can DM you and get your address and send it to you. DMs will come from that account and only that account. So not that anyone's going to be scamming you off of Red Rum, but just in case. Other than that, I'll see you next week. Bye.